And Sarah will make a start.
Thank you very much, Bella. Hi,
Although I can't
everyone.
hear you, Sarah.
Ah.
Which is always a good start. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
No.
I'm not on mute. Ah.
I can hear.
Unless it's just.
Can anyone hear me?
I can hear you
I
now.
can hear her.
Yeah.
Oh,
Maybe it was my
okay.
audio. Okay, great.
Okay,
Off we go then.
so after that minor technical hitch, so hello again, everybody, and welcome once again to this Spillers webinar on feeding horses prone to gastric ulcers. I'm going to do my very best to keep us to time this evening, so I'm going to jump straight in to the first slide. On the screen now, you will have a participant code for slido.com. You can access Slido on a mobile or a tablet or any device that you have to hand. You can either scan that code, the QR code on the screen, or you can enter that code on the left, 066752. This will just allow you to take part in a couple of polls throughout this evening, just to make it a little bit more interactive so that you're not listening to me for the whole 45 minutes before we move on to questions. A few thoughts before we get on to feed and management tips. Diet is by no means the only risk for gastric ulcers. Diet is not a cure for gastric ulcers, but diet is a risk factor that we can influence. So that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Diet is one thing that we can do something about, something that we've got some control over. Appropriate changes in diet and management can help to reduce the risk and severity of gastric ulcers. But it's also important to remember, even if your horse doesn't have gastric ulcers, that the nutritional recommendations that we make this evening are sound nutritional advice for any horse. But thinking about the risk factors for ulcers specifically and what we can do to help manage that risk, research published by Spillers in collaboration with colleagues in Spain and Denmark was the very first scientific, and as far as I'm aware, so far the only scientific research to prove that changes in diet can help to reduce the recurrence of non-glandular ulcers. So in this study, there were 52 horses with grade 2, 3 and 4 gastric ulcers. And these horses were divided into pairs according to their management, the type and intensity of work that they were in, and the severity of their gastric ulcers. So, for example, a racehorse with grade 4 gastric ulcers would have been paired with another racehorse with grade 4 gastric ulcers. Those two horses would have been on the same yard and following the same training regime, the same management, the same forage, etc. One horse from each of those pairs continued with their normal hard feed or bucket feed, while the other horse had their feed replaced with the trial feed. And that trial feed was a 50-50 ratio of Spillers power cubes and Spillers ulcer fibre. Horses with grade 3 and grade 4 ulcers were treated with the recommended course of omeprazole, and that took 6 weeks. And all horses were scoped at the start of the study, immediately after omeprazole treatment had finished, and 6 weeks after treatment had stopped. Apologies, the omeprazole treatment was 4 weeks, so it was a 10-week study in total. The all-important results The trial diet had no effect on grade 2 ulcers. So those horses with grade 2 ulcers were not significantly worse or better at the end of the study than they were at the start. The majority of horses, and in fact this was all but one horse with grade 3 or grade 4 ulcers, improved as a result of omeprazole treatment. The really interesting and positive thing is what happened after treatment had stopped. So overall, the horses that were on the trial diet remained improved 6 weeks after treatment had stopped. In contrast, horses that hadn't had their feed changed overall were no better at the end of the study than they were before they started. So overall, those horses regressed, so they were no better overall than they were at the start of the study. Equine gastric ulcer syndrome, or EGUS, includes ulcers in the non-glandular, so the upper region of the stomach, and also ulcers in the glandular or the lower region of the stomach. And it's thought that ulcers in the upper region of the stomach are most likely to be caused by acid injury, so exposure of the stomach lining to acid. Although the nutritional management of glandular and non-glandular ulcers is the same, we're going to be focusing this evening really on non-glandular ulcers. So everything that follows, really we're talking about non-glandular ulcers, although as I said, the feeding management recommendations are generally the same. If you suspect your horse may have gastric ulcers, please do speak to your vet, because veterinary diagnosis is essential. One reason for that is that depending on the severity of the ulcers, the horse may need veterinary treatment with omeprazole, for example, in order for those lesions to heal. It's also important to establish whether you're dealing with glandular or non-glandular ulcers. Although the nutritional management is generally the same, glandular ulcers are less likely to respond to changes in diet and treatment. So the first opportunity for you to get involved this evening, I just want to hear your thoughts. What concerns you most about feeding horses prone to gastric ulcers? So you can type in your answer. You're not restricted to the amount of answers that you can give. So go wild, add as many comments as you like, and we should start to see those pop up on the screen in a moment or two. Starch, very good. Restricting forage for my fat horse. Yeah, that's a question that we get asked quite a lot. Making it worse, providing energy, amounts, how much to feed, feeding oil. Lots of really good comments. Pain and discomfort, hay or haylage. Cost, something that's on everybody's mind at the moment, I'm sure. Great. Thank you, everybody that has added a comment. Hopefully, all of your questions will be addressed in the slides that follow. So the first tip of the evening, base the diet on forage. This might seem like old news, but you really can't underestimate the importance of forage. And ideally, I'm sure you all know, forage should be fed ad lib, which of course means as much as the horse or pony will eat. Saliva provides a natural buffer for stomach acid, but unlike people, horses only produce saliva when they chew. So if we limit their opportunity to chew, we limit their saliva production and therefore limit their ability to neutralise acid. Forage accounts for a large proportion of the horse's daily calorie intake. For some horses, of course, it's 100% of their calories. And so providing plenty of forage helps to reduce the reliance on bucket feed for energy. Just a little reminder that energy and calories are simply two different words used to describe exactly the same thing. A bit like you say tomato, I say tomato. So technically, energy in horse feed is measured or described in megajoules of digestible energy, but sometimes we use the word calories because it's a term that resonates with all of us and tends to make sense when we're talking about weight gain and diet or weight loss. And alongside providing forage ad lib, think about providing forage while travelling. So somebody made a very good point in the word cloud a few moments ago about forage intake for good doers, because we know there are some horses for which ad lib forage just isn't appropriate. As a starting point, or if possible, look for ways to reduce the calorie density of your forage rather than restricting the amount fed. So possible options for that are feeding soaked hay or replacing part of the forage ration with straw, for example. If you can reduce the calorie density of the forage in the diet, you may find that you either don't need to restrict it or you don't need to restrict it so severely. You can also consider restricting grass intake, perhaps by strip grazing, using a grazing muzzle, or implementing a track system. Every horse or pony is, of course, an individual, so the total amount of forage restriction that will be required and the best method of restricting forage will vary between individual horses and depending on your circumstances and their circumstances. Grazing muzzles are something that can promote a bit of a Marmite reaction amongst horse owners. Some love them, some hate them. But for some horses, they can be a really useful way of restricting grass intake while still allowing time out at grass and pasture. So on average, grazing muzzles have been shown to restrict grass intake by approximately 80%, regardless of the season. So this does mean that you can use a grazing muzzle in the winter months too, provided you make sure that the grass is long enough to be accessed through the base of the muzzle. There are lots of safety tips and recommendations to bear in mind when it comes to using a grazing muzzle. They include not leaving the muzzle on 24/7, introducing your horse to wearing a muzzle gradually, looking out for signs of rubbing or discomfort, monitoring herd dynamics, monitoring the horse's behaviour in the horse that's wearing the muzzle, having teeth monitored regularly, because wearing a muzzle for long periods can cause the horse's teeth to wear unevenly. But contact a nutritionist for advice on how to use a muzzle safely. Soaking hay helps to reduce the water-soluble carbohydrate or the sugar content. And of course, less sugar means fewer calories. We're often asked how long you should soak your hay to help reduce the sugar content. And this is one situation where if you ask 10 people, you're quite likely to get 10 different answers. And in truth, the ideal soaking time is not set in stone. We do know that water temperature influences sugar losses. We know that the length of time you soak for influences sugar losses. Unfortunately, losses are variable, and in UK hays at least, they're quite unpredictable. But based on the published research that's available to date, our recommendation is that you soak for 1 to 3 hours in warm weather and 6 to 12 hours in cold weather. Another important tip, unless you're feeding soaked hay ad lib, you should increase the amount of hay you soak by approximately 20% in order to make sure that you don't restrict your horse's forage intake too severely. And I will come back to that point shortly. Straw, depending on the individual horse, you can look to replace up to 30 to 50% of the total forage ration with straw. Hygienic quality is more important than the type of straw fed, so you can feed oat, barley or wheat straw. Make sure that the horse or pony has good teeth. It's important to introduce straw to the diet gradually, and you may not realise that you can steam straw before feeding to improve the hygienic quality, just as you can steam hay. So what about restricting forage intake? Because for some good doers or overweight horses, some level of forage restriction may be needed. So replacing part of the forage with straw or soaking hay alone may not be sufficient. The current advice is for the large majority of horses and ponies, total daily forage intake should not be restricted to less than 1.5% of current body weight on a dry matter basis. So the current body weight part is important. If your horse or pony is overweight and they're on a diet, you need to adjust the amount of forage that you feed as they lose weight. And the dry matter part is important. So a 500 kilo horse, 1.5% of their body weight is 7.5 kilos. But what does this term dry matter really mean? It's something that often causes confusion, but is really important to try and get your head around if you're restricting your horse's forage intake, and particularly if you're doing that and they don't have access to grazing. So all forage, even unsoaked hay, contains some water. Hay typically contains around 10 to 15% water, and haylage is approximately 20 to 50% water. The term as fed, or sometimes we use the term fresh weight, is the amount of hay or haylage you weigh out. Dry matter is the amount of hay or haylage that you weigh out minus the water. So the water content doesn't count towards your horse's forage intake, which means you need to adjust the amount you feed according to the water content. So if, for example, you weigh out 7.5 kilos of hay, in dry matter terms, that's only 6.5 to 7 kilos of dry matter or actual hay. If you weigh out 7.5 kilos of haylage, the water content is far more variable, but it will be between 3.75, so just over 3.5 kilos to 6 kilos of hay. The rest will be water. Remember, haylage can contain as much as 50% water, so half of everything that you weigh out and put in your net could be water. So what does this all mean in practice? How much forage do you need to weigh out and put in your hay net? As a guide for a 500 kilo horse without access to grazing, once you account for the water content, you should feed a minimum of 8 to 9 kilos of hay if you're going to feed it dry, 10 to 11 kilos of hay if you're going to soak it before you feed it. So that 10 to 11 kilos is the unsoaked weight, or 10 to 14 kilos of haylage. So if you think back to a few slides before, I said you need to increase the amount of hay you soak by around 20% unless you're going to feed it ad lib. That's because when you soak your hay net, you lose nutrients and therefore dry matter into the water. So in real terms, your hay net will contain less actual hay and more water once you've soaked it. So to make sure that you don't restrict your horse or pony's forage intake too severely, you need to increase the amount you soak. If you are restricting the amount of forage that you give your horses, it's really important to try and avoid long periods without forage. So the risk of gastric ulcers was seen to be 3.5 to 4 times higher in one study in horses left for more than 6 hours without forage. There are a few ways that you might want to try extending your horse's eating time, so dividing restricted rations into multiple servings. You could try using double-layered small-hold haylage nets. You could, if you have the budget to allow, you could try an automatic hay feeder that will dispense hay to your horse throughout the day or night at timed intervals, but admittedly, this is an expensive option. You could also consider turning out at night, because potentially avoiding long periods without forage may be easier during the day. It might be easier to persuade somebody to give your horse a hay net at lunchtime than it is in the middle of the night. So moving away from forage, which should undoubtedly be the foundation of the diet, a balancer is the ideal way to provide good doers with the vitamins, minerals and quality protein needed to balance forage. The low feeding rate means that they provide a limited amount of calories, starch and sugar per daily serving. So regardless of which brand of balancer you choose, typically the feeding rate for a balancer is 500 grams per day for a 500 kilo horse, which is much lower than the recommended amount of mix or cube, for example. Depending on the balancer you choose, it may also include added functional ingredients such as digestive or joint support too. Restricting starch and sugar intake is another important tip. So cereal grains are the largest source of starch in the horse's diet, and the fermentation of starch in the stomach leads to the production of volatile fatty acids. And it's thought that the combination of an increase in volatile fatty acids and a low pH in the stomach leads to the development of gastric ulcers. So how much starch and sugar is too much? Well, the current advice is that non-structural carbohydrate, that's the technical term, or starch and sugar, intake from bucket feed should be restricted to less than 1 gram per kilogram of body weight per meal, and ideally to less than 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So for a 500 kilo horse, that equates to less than 500 grams of starch and sugar per meal and less than 1 kilo of starch and sugar per day. A little tip if you're trying to calculate your horse's starch and sugar intake, remember that 10% is equal to 100 grams per kilogram. It is also important to bear in mind that percentages only tell part of the story. So the total amount of starch and sugar that your horse will consume from any feed will of course depend on the amount that's eaten. So if you have a feed, 1 kilo of feed with a combined starch and sugar content of 18% will provide 180 grams of starch. But if you feed 2 kilos of a feed with a combined starch and sugar content of 9%, that will also be 180 grams of starch and sugar. So another opportunity for you to get involved, which is higher in energy. Remember, energy and calories are exactly the same thing. Which is higher in energy, 500 mils of oil or 1 kilo of oats? I'll give it a few more seconds. I can see the numbers going up. 12, 13 responses so far. We start to see the sliders change a little bit. We've got a bit of a split. Okay, so poll seems to have settled. Well done to everybody who opted for oil. So 500 mils of oil provides approximately 17.5 megajoules of digestible energy, and a kilo of oats provides around 11 megajoules of digestible energy. So if your horse or pony doesn't maintain weight easily on forage alone, or forage in a balancer, then look for fibre-based feeds that are low in starch and sugar. Sometimes a low-calorie fibre feed may be sufficient, but if you do need a feed that's high in calories, look for feeds that are high in oil as opposed to cereal starch. Oil is approximately 2.5 times higher in energy or calories compared to cereal grains, but is starch and sugar-free. Another way of feeding oil is, of course, to feed oil from a bottle. Many owners ask us about adding oil on top of their horse's current feed, and that absolutely is an option. All oils provide a similar amount of energy, around 3.5 megajoules of digestible energy per 100 ml. So it doesn't matter which oil you choose in terms of its calorific value. You should always make sure that the oil you feed is fresh and of human grade quality. The freshness is really important in hot weather. Remember that oil can quickly go rancid when it's hot. Always introduce oil gradually. As a guide, we suggest around 100 mils of oil per week. As a general rule of thumb, you can add up to 100 mils of oil per 100 kilos of body weight per day to your current feed. So that equates to 500 mils of oil for a 500 kilo horse. However, it is really important to remember that high oil diets need to be balanced with additional vitamin E. So it's a really good idea to speak to a nutritionist for advice before adding oil on top of your horse's feed, or before using a high oil feed that doesn't have added vitamins and minerals, just to make sure that your horse's base diet does provide enough vitamin E to balance the high oil content. Also, remember that not all horses prone to ulcers need a high oil diet. So there's very little evidence to suggest that oil per se is protective. There was one study in ponies, and apologies, that says 5 mils of corn oil, but the slide should say 45 mils of corn oil for 5 weeks via gastric cannula, reduced gastric acid output and increased prostaglandin levels. So prostaglandin is a compound that inhibits acid production. The important thing to note here is that this was oil given by gastric cannula, so directly into the stomach. This wasn't oil from a bottle poured on top of the horse's feed. Also remember that oil is very high in calories, so you should always feed according to your horse's body condition. So if your horse is overweight or a good doer, don't just increase their oil intake in order to try and protect them from gastric ulcers. The real benefit of feeding oil for horses with ulcers is because it's high in calories, but starch and sugar free. Another useful tip is to add short chop fibre to meals. So feeding short chop fibre is a great way of helping to slow eating time and increase chewing. Remember that chewing increases saliva production, and saliva provides a natural buffer to stomach acid. This may be particularly important in horses that have limited access to forage. Ideally, choose a short chop fibre containing alfalfa. Alfalfa is naturally high in protein and calcium, and that protein and calcium content is thought to help buffer stomach acid. Do bear in mind that the ingredients in horse feeds are all naturally occurring, or the majority of ingredients in horse feeds are naturally occurring raw materials. So the texture of alfalfa, for example, can vary depending on the cut and the time of the year. So try to feed soft, short chopped fibres. Feeding short chopped fibre or forage prior to exercise helps to perform a protective fibre mat over the contents of the stomach, which helps to reduce gastric splashing. So exercise increases abdominal pressure. Gastric acid is produced in the lower region of the stomach. And as the horse starts to exercise and the intensity of that exercise increases, so cantering and galloping, jumping, for example, the highly acidic contents of the stomach can splash onto the upper region of the stomach. And that upper region of the stomach doesn't have the same protective mucus lining as the lower region, and that splashing of acid, exposure of the stomach lining to acid, can lead to the development of ulcers. So on the screen, you can see a picture of a fasted stomach and a fed stomach. This was actually a foal in foals, these pictures were taken, but the picture on the left, you can see the gastric fluid in the bottom of the stomach, and the picture on the right, the foal has been fed alfalfa, which has formed that fibrous mat over the top of the stomach contents. Feeding small meals has lots of potential benefits, but in regards to gastric ulcers, feeding small meals helps to reduce the amount of starch and sugar consumed in each meal. So as a maximum, restrict meals to 2 kilos for horses and less for ponies. Remember to feed your horses by weight and not by volume. So a standard stub scoop, for example, holds around 2 kilos of cubes, 1.5 kilos of mix, and then depending on the chopped fibre that you use, it could be between 300 to 600 grams of fibre, depending on whether or not it contains any sort of pellets like a vitamin and mineral pellet or a grass nut or alfalfa pellets, straw nuts, for example. Choosing beta EGUS approved feeds can provide some added reassurance of their suitability for horses prone to gastric ulcers. They are by no means the only feeds that are suitable for horses and ponies prone to gastric ulcers. We have 4 feeds within our range that carry the beta EGUS approval mark, but we have a number of other feeds that we regularly recommend to horses prone to gastric ulcers. The BETA stands for British Equestrian Trade Association, and EGUS, of course, equine gastric ulcer syndrome. And in order to be awarded the beta EGUS approval mark, feeds do have to pass a rigorous 3-step approval process. So the feed has to be analysed by an independent laboratory to make sure that it delivers the nutrient profile that we say on the bag. The packaging and all of the marketing materials and the feeding rate, the nutritional specification, all gets reviewed by an independent nutrition consultant employed by BETA or brought in by BETA, and the packaging and all advertising materials has to be approved by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, or the VMD. And the VMD review all of the claims that are made about the product to ensure that they're not medicinal. So feeds by law should not claim to cure, treat, or prevent gastric ulcers. Provide as much turnout as possible. In general, the increased turnout reduces the risk of gastric ulcers, but there are some important points to remember. horses that are turned out 24/7 still do get gastric ulcers, particularly if they're on high starch diets. Consider the horse's temperament. So horses that have spent a lot of time stabled, for example, may not be very relaxed turned out in the field, or if you leave a horse turned out when all of the other horses have been brought in, if they are stressed, walking fence line, for example, turnout in those situations may be counterproductive because stress is also a risk factor for gastric ulcers. And of course, the more time they're stood by the gate or fence walking, they're not eating forage and chewing. And even winter grazing may exceed calorie requirements for good doers. So we talked right back at the beginning about possibly needing to restrict grass intake for good doers to prevent weight gain. I'm sure that nobody listening this evening would leave their horse without access to water, but in one of the studies we did back in 2009, turning horses out without access to water was also seen to be a risk factor for gastric ulcers, although we don't fully understand the reason for that. And then a final tip for this evening is to be cautious about using electrolyte pastes. So a study in endurance horses found an increase in the number and severity of gastric ulcers in horses that were given repeated concentrated or multiple concentrated electrolyte syringes versus a placebo. So I hope that that's been interesting and helpful and that everybody has taken a few tips away with them. We have come to the end with plenty of time for questions. So I will stop sharing the slides and Bella will stop the recording. And if